Well, unfortunately, when you're looking at it right now, I'm still one of the only Black female CEOs, even though I'm not in the industry anymore. So we haven't made as much progress as I would like us to have made. And I work still very hard to change that. I work with the Paley Center, I work with American Film Institute. Those are two media organizations that, provide opportunities for diverse individuals. And the corporate culture was never reflective of the programming that was put on the air. And unfortunately, that's still the case. I mean, it was at BET because we were run primarily by African Americans, but other networks didn't have high ranking African American executives, even if they were doing Black programming. And you would have some in the community complaining about that and complaining that the programming was not authentic because of that.
Good evening and welcome to your library. My name is David Leonard, president of the BPL and host of our Arc of History series. Tonight's conversation is part of our Arc of History Repairing America series, and tonight presented in conjunction with the Christine Business Library and Innovation Center. Before we get to tonight's very special guest, here now is Gregor Smart, curator of the Christine Business Library and Innovation Center, to introduce you to the center and its programs and services once again. Gregor, over to you.
For those who are not familiar with our library, I'd like to give a quick overview of our resources and upcoming programs. We were founded in 1930 by Louis Kirstein. He was a trustee of the BPL and a VP of Filene's department store. So he gave funds to the city of Boston to get a business library started. We continue that work today, and our focus areas include, but are not limited to, creative software and innovation, entrepreneurship and small business, support for job seekers, and with our Dre Investment Center, financial wellness. And with that, make sure that you stay up to date on our programs by signing up to our newsletter. And with that, I will send it back to David, and thank you.
And so within the context of the business sponsorship of this part of the series, the Repairing America theme for 2020 and 21 provides us with an opportunity to engage with issues facing our country, trying to bend our arc of history a little more directly towards justice for all. It also gives us the opportunity to give voice to leaders, experts, and commentators, some of whom may not always have been afforded such opportunities. Tonight, I'm pleased to be in conversation with our guest, Ms. Debra Lee. Tonight, Ms. Lee will have advice for companies that are facing external disruption or internal change. Debra Lee will share lessons learned from her career as one of America's few African-American women CEOs and on boards ranging from Marriott to Twitter. Honored as an Adweek disruptor, as a champion for change in the Time's Up movement, and a change agent on prominent corporate boards, she provides essential approaches for individuals and organizations to thrive and triumph in a constantly changing world. During her 3 decades-long career with BET, Black Entertainment Television, where her many honors and recognitions include being named to the Hollywood Reporter's 100 Most Powerful Women in Entertainment, Billboard's Power 100, and Adweek's Disruptors list, Debra Lee saw her industry radically disrupted by technology, undergo a revolution in content delivery, and celebrating the ascendance of the Black media consumer. She also saw BET go public and be acquired by media giant Viacom, all capped off by a highly successful transition of leadership as she succeeded the company's legendary founder as chairman and CEO. She went on to shape BET into a catalyst for change via groundbreaking programming that challenged perceptions and more authentically reflected Black America. The rebrand, culture shift, and mission focus under her leadership transformed BET into the largest global company dedicated to Black programming. We will also be hearing more of what Ms. Lee is focused on now, including the Monarchs Collective. Ms. Debra Lee, welcome to the program. It's so good to have you here.
Great. I'm so delighted to be here. And David, thank you for that amazing introduction. And I feel like I'm back in Boston, seeing the library behind you. I spent 4 lovely years in Boston, and going downtown was always a special event. So this brings back fond memories.
In some ways, it may be coming a little full circle. I'd love to have you start out by telling us a little bit about your early biography and leading up to the move to BET.
Right. Well, the story gets longer the older I get. But I started out in a military family. My father was a captain in the Army. And so I was born in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and moved to Germany early on, and then to Washington, D.C., and then to Compton for a couple of years. And then when my father retired, we moved to Greensboro, North Carolina in the 60s. And at that point, Greensboro was still a very segregated town. You might remember that some of the sit-ins were in Greensboro. Those happened before we moved there, but it was still a very Southern segregated town. And I ended up going to Black schools for the first time. And I think it really changed the trajectory of my life. I learned how to be a leader. We may not have had the resources at our schools that the white schools had, but we had teachers who really believed in us and really knew that we were going to have to be exceptional to succeed. So they made sure we learned all the basic skills. And from there, from Greensboro, I went to Brown University, which was unheard of. North Carolina itself had such a great college system that very few people left the state. And not many went as far as Providence, Rhode Island. So I spent 4 years in Providence, and then after that, ended up at Harvard Law School.
Further north.
Further north.
We have a picture of you there from that period.
I look very different, don't I? That is a picture of me and my father, Major Lee, the day I graduated from Harvard Law School and the Kennedy School of Government. I got my master's in public policy at the same time. And that was a very proud day for my father. He wanted me to be a lawyer more than I wanted to be a lawyer. So we compromised, and I got 2 degrees. I don't know if that's really a compromise. But anyway, it was a great 4 years. And this photo brings back amazing memories.
And it must have been interesting coming to Boston at that particular moment in time, both because you were coming from the South, but also what was going on in Boston during this time that you would spend at Harvard.
Yeah, it was interesting. My view of Boston before I got there was, the stories about the Kennedys and how liberal they were, and how liberal Boston was. And my dad knew Eddie Brooke. They grew up together. He was a Black senator from Boston. And when I got to Boston, it was a very different city. It was 1976, and it was in the middle of the desegregation struggles in Boston. And so there was a lot of bus violence related to busing. And it was the first time I had been told in any city not to go to certain areas. I was told not to go to the North End, not to go to South Boston, don't wear your Harvard Law School t-shirt downtown. So it's a very, very tense time in Boston. And I know it's changed a lot since then, but it was a tough time to be a Black Harvard Law student during that time.
Right, and we may come back to that as we shift later in the conversation back to the national issues of today versus then. But maybe let's continue with your story, because I think after Harvard you were headed to Washington D.C. and that was supposed to be the next chapter. But walk us through what happens next.
Well, I wanted to go into government. I thought that that was a good compromise. At first, I thought I was going to save the world after graduating from Harvard. And, I thought I was going to be the next Thurgood Marshall or Constance Baker Motley. But early on during law school, it became clear those type of careers weren't really available anymore, though many of the wars had been won already. So I decided to go into government and focus on public policy. And I had accepted a job with the Securities and Exchange Commission in their policy office. And I was told it was a great office and a good place to start. And then a judge I had done some work for at Harvard Law School, Judge John Kratzley, called me in and said he knew a judge in DC, and a friend of the judge, another judge down the hall, was interested in hiring a third law clerk, and would I be interested? And I hadn't applied for any law any clerkships because I wasn't really interested in litigation. So, I didn't do it. But when a federal clerkship falls in your lap, it's kind of hard to say no. So I accepted the clerkship, moved to Washington, postponed my career starting at the SEC. And then during that year, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And he put a hiring freeze on, and I didn't necessarily want to go into a Republican administration. So my whole life changed. I went to a law firm to hide out until the Democrats came back in. And if you recall that time period, it took the Democrats 12 years to come back in. There were a couple of Reagan and a couple of Bushes, and it took a while. So after 5 years at the law firm, I decided it was time to leave. And luckily for me, BET was a client. And the founder and CEO, Bob Johnson, asked me to come over and start the legal department. And the great thing about that for me was, one, it was in an industry I was interested in, media and communications. And two, it kept me in Washington. I didn't necessarily want to move to New York or LA, where most media companies were at that time. So I was able to stay in DC and start the legal department. And as they say, the rest is history. 32 years later, I stepped down. But it was an exciting time at BET, and I was able to do more business affairs and deals than I imagined. And over time, I found out I really liked business much more than I thought I would. And I made the switch from the general counsel's office to become chief operating officer in 1995, and then eventually CEO in 2005.
So I want to ask a couple of questions about the entertainment industry at that time.
Okay.
BET coming on the scene, and what the total culture was really like, because we were in many ways, I think, at the very early stages of what happened beyond the main broadcast channels. So could you just paint us a picture of what BET was trying to do at that time, and maybe just a mini insight into the industry?
Okay. Well, at that point, 1986, when I joined the company, BET was about 5 years old, and it had just turned profitable. And there was no cable in DC or in most major areas. If you remember, cable started in the suburbs and in areas that couldn't get good TV reception. So the cities were the last to be wired. So even though BET was located headquartered in DC, no one there had ever seen it. So it was funny, when I was leaving the law firm, the partners were like, "You're going where? And what is BET?" So it's funny to look back on. But anyway, BET was the first and only network, cable network dedicated to the African-American marketplace. And it was created in 1980. But before then, there were no networks dedicated to the African-American community. And so it was used, and I say that in the nicest way, by cable operators when they went into cities to show the mayors, who a lot of whom were Black, that they were devoted to doing Black programming. And so it was very handy for the cable operators that BET existed. And we were the only one out there doing it for a long time. The great thing about cable is, you know, you had 30, 40 channels when it first started. That doesn't sound like very many now, but at that point you went from 4 channels, because I'm including Fox, to 30 or 40 channels. So that seemed like a lot and seemed like the perfect place to build diverse programming. So you had things like Lifetime or Nickelodeon for children or BET or the Golf Channel. Of course, now we have 500 channels, and you know, our young people can't imagine any other way. But this was the early days of cable, and it was really exciting time. You know, BET had a growth spurt of subscribers and revenues, and it kept going well. And then John Malone sat on our board. John Malone was from TCI. And at one point in 1991, he said, well, maybe you all should think about going public. And that was a brand new idea. And, you know, it took us 10 months, but we took the company public. And it turned out we were the first African-American company traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Wow. Which also, when people ask me about highlights of my career, I always go back to that morning on the floor of the stock exchange when BET first started trading. It was a grand moment.
So did you ring the bell, or?
I did not. None of us did. They didn't even have us. Someone else rang the bell that day, which, but it was, you know, all the Black folks who had worked at the New York Stock Exchange over the years, they were so excited to see us because they had never seen a Black company go public. So we got a warm welcome. They just didn't let us ring the bell. I don't know why. But I was still general counsel at the time. So for me, it was the end of 10 months of really hard work because I had to supervise the SEC filings, and took me back to the SEC.
The burden of the logistics would fall on the general counsel's office for sure.
So I was the one up until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, making sure the documents were right. And I remember the day we took the filing documents to the SEC, I was still making changes in the car. There were still edits coming in. But I remember when I took the filing papers inside, and the people who worked at the SEC were giving me high fives, and they were so happy. So it was really a great experience, and one I'll never forget.
So I mean, that's kind of amazing to think back on that time, but for obvious reasons, someone had to be the first, and some company had to be the first. So
right.
What did that do to the culture of BET at the time to have passed that milestone?
Yeah, well, one thing, the most important thing, it gave us more revenue to invest, more funds to invest. So we were able to grow, as you mentioned earlier, into other areas. We started a magazine division, we started a film division, we opened restaurants. Anything we can put the BET brand on, we considered for a good 30 minutes. Some we executed on, and others we didn't. But it gave us a sense of just solidarity and comfort that we weren't going to be a business that went out of business, that we were going to be around for a long time. And the opening price, share price, was $17, and the first day it went up to $29. So we proved we were a successful American story, not just a Black American story, a successful corporate story. So it was very exciting.
And it sounds like the cable operators were using at this point in time the existence of BET as a way of demonstrating for probably what made sense at that moment. This was their way of being more inclusive and having offerings. But
exactly,
my sense is once you become the chief executive, we start to see a broadening of that agenda, really. And I remember picking up an article when I was researching for tonight's conversation, where it says, well, why were there no Black people on Friends, as an example of of New York culture? That made no
Right,
sense. And so
right.
somewhere along the line, there's this shift from having it as a niche offering to
Hmm.
being simply more, if I can use the word, integrated.
Right. And broader in its offerings. I mean, just to take you back a little bit, when I grew up, there was Soul Train on Saturday
Yeah,
afternoons, and
right.
that was a syndicated show with Black people on it. And then there were shows like Ed Sullivan, where the Supremes or the Temptations would come on. Or there was a show called Julia. I don't know if I'm ahead of your time, but it was Diane Carroll, and it was a show about a widower. She was a widower, not divorced. Her husband had died, and she had a little son who's the cutest thing. But my point is, there wasn't very much offering on TV that had Black people. So with BET, you got this big rush of mostly music programming and other kinds of programming. And then, there were the other questions. Okay, we have BET, but what about the main networks? What about competitors to BET? Why do we just have one network? So it grew, and we got criticism, and we got applause and awards, but it was an interesting time. And when you look at television today, it's made a lot of progress.
And how do you look back on your role in making some of that progress? And do tell us who your pet is, because I think
No,
I think someone
she's
is joining you
right.
on
She's a
your.
little frustrated. That's Billy. She's
Oh, hey, Billy.
our rescue dog,
Awesome.
and she just got a little bored. But anyway, she'll be back.
So
But
yeah, you're looking back on your role in bringing about some of the progress that was happening around this time.
right. Because when I took over, all of a sudden people started asking me what my vision for the company was. And, when you're COO, no one asks you what your vision is. You're just there to implement someone else's vision. So what I saw happening was that original programming was becoming more and more important to cable networks. They were no longer just transmitting other people's programming. They were trying to lay the groundwork to create their own hits. And as the competition became stiffer, ratings became very important. And I saw that programming was also going international. And so to do that, you had to own the rights to your programming. You couldn't take anything across the pond if you didn't own it. So I realized early on that it was very important for us to create our own programming. And our audience didn't understand why we were different from CBS, NBC, or ABC. They were like, why don't you have your own sitcoms? Why don't you have dramas? And at the time, we were about 60% music videos, which some people liked and some people didn't like, but it was very cheap programming. So that's how we grew. But as we grew our revenue, our audience wanted to see more from us. And so when I took over, I said, my vision is to create authentic, original programming for our network, and the highest quality possible, because there's not enough out there. And that's what I started doing. And luckily, by that time, Viacom had acquired BET. And so we had more resources. We were in the company with brands like MTV and Nickelodeon and VH1. And so over time, I was able to convince Viacom executives to invest more in BET, that we had a very loyal audience. And if we provided high quality programming, they would show up. And the one time we put on a show called The Game, which was originally on the CW network, and CW canceled the the show, the game, and we had a letter writing campaign from our audience asking us to pick up the show. And it had the reruns of the show had aired on BET, and they had done really well. So it took us about 2 years to convince CBS to give us the rights to produce the show because they were the production company. But they finally allowed us to do it, and the show had been off the air for 2 years. And when it was on the CW, it got about 1.5 million viewers every week, which wasn't bad. And when we brought it back, and we took over the production ourselves, we didn't have a separate production company, but we hired a lot of the people who had worked on it before. But anyway, the night it debuted on BET, we got 7.7 million viewers. And in my book, that was like winning the Super Bowl, and I think it's still a record for a sitcom on cable. It's still a record in the books. So that proved the point that if we did high quality, authentic programming, that our audience would show up for it. I remember Tyler Perry sent me flowers. The guy who was running TV One called me to congratulate me. And by this time we had a lot of competition, not only on cable, but on the networks, because people were beginning to realize that the African-American audience was loyal and would show up. They didn't care where the programming was. They just liked seeing stories about themselves. So we had a lot of competition. So it was the perfect timing to start having hit shows where we could compete.
And it strikes me as someone who has studied a little bit of American culture, because I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up in Ireland, and certainly we watched American television growing up. And, I've always thought that television has played a really important role in modern American culture.
Right.
It's the place where people want to see people like themselves. And so it provides an opportunity, and I'd love your comment on this, for society as we would like it to be, perhaps more so than how we often experience it in our own lives.
Right. And if you look at television history, I'm on the board of the Paley Center, and they keep all the shows and have a gala once a year. And they've done an award show on Black programming and Hispanic programming and LGBTQ. And when you look back at the history, you'll see major shows and major subject matters related to how the world is changing. Like when Ellen announced on air on her show that she was gay. I mean, that was a momentous time in that community. For Black people, the Cosby Show, for the first time showed a upper middle class Black family and their day-to-day struggles, but it did so well. And I'm sure the same thing is true in the Hispanic market. Or when you look at something like Crazy Rich Asians, why did it take Hollywood so long to make a movie about Asian people? And the fact that it did so well just shows you that that community and other communities who went to see the film were hungry for that kind of programming. So, I don't know if you remember the time that Sammy Davis Jr. kissed, was it Richard Nixon? Someone. I mean, there's been so many amazing moments in history that I love, in television history, that I love looking back on it and seeing how it's changed the world. And as you said, there have also been times that have not been so progressive, like Friends. I mean, no one complained about that at the time. It was, years later that people started looking back and say, how do you have a group of friends in New York and there's no one Black in the show? So I think sometimes, TV shows have held us back as in addition to propelling us. It's a powerful medium, and if you're, a young Black woman like me, or young Black girl, it's really powerful to see yourself in different ways on TV. And if you don't, you think there's something wrong.
Well, I think in particular of being a science fiction buff,
Hmm.
the early kiss between Lieutenant Uhura and
Right.
Jim Kirk, and
Big thing.
big momentous moment on that front. Um,
Hmm.
but did you find that this was reflected in, say, the boardrooms or the culture of the entertainment companies? So, it can be one thing to have shows that reflect a more aspirational values, but was the culture of the companies themselves? I mean, we introduced you as one of the first Black women CEOs. Put that together for us, if you would.
Well, unfortunately, when you're looking at it right now, I'm still one of the only Black female CEOs, even though I'm not in the industry anymore. So we haven't made as much progress as I would like us to have made. And I work still very hard to change that. I work with the Paley Center, I work with American Film Institute. Those are two media organizations that, provide opportunities for diverse individuals. And the corporate culture was never reflective of the programming that was put on the air. And unfortunately, that's still the case. I mean, it was at BET because we were run primarily by African Americans, but other networks didn't have high ranking African American executives, even if they were doing Black programming. And you would have some in the community complaining about that and complaining that the programming was not authentic because of that. So it's been an interesting history, and you see after the murder of George Floyd last May, that so many companies donated large sums of money or did beautiful PSAs saying they supported Black Lives Matter. But the younger people looked at the boards of these companies and looked at the C-suites, and they said, well, how can you support Black Lives Matter if there's no one Black on your board, if there's no one Black in your C-suite, if there are no women on your board? So, the corporations, especially in the media business and the music industry and fashion brands and cosmetic companies, there were specific industries that had real problems with representation. And they were forced to quickly try to make some changes, either by putting diverse individuals on the boards or hiring more, because people wanted to know what was going on behind the curtain. So, there's still a lot to be done, and there's still a really big push for diverse individuals in front of the camera and behind the camera. And that's why, when you look at the Golden Globes or, the Sunday with the Oscars, there will always be the talent, and people will ask, how did they fare as diverse talent? But there are also now directors and costume designers like Ruth Carter and other people who are behind the camera that are getting opportunities or are making opportunities for themselves. There are more Black production companies now than ever before. And, things are changing, but unfortunately not fast enough.
Yeah, particularly when we layer together not just the challenges around race, but also the challenges around gender. And
Right,
for a Black woman, you've got both to compete with. We have a couple
right.
of pictures of I think a couple of significant individuals with you. We have Regina King. If you wouldn't mind just telling us about the significance of Regina King and Deborah Roberts.
Right. Well, this one is of Regina King. We were at a luncheon during Oscar week that American Film Institute, AFI, picks the 10 best television shows and the 10 best movies every year. And they start off the week with their award luncheon. But it's interesting, the people that win know they've won before they show up. So I think, I can't remember what exactly Regina King won this year, but she's been on such a roll for the past 3 or 4 years, not only in terms of her acting ability, but now with her director career. And, she got so much recognition for directing One Night in Miami this year. So she's a good friend and she always gives me credit. She says the first movie she ever directed was a BET made for TV movie. So that always makes me very proud that she remembers that. I think the next photo, that is a show I did with a group called the History Makers. They do an annual gala. It's kind of like This Is Your Life, if anyone remembers that. And this is Deborah Roberts. She interviewed me, and the result of the taping is a show that airs on PBS stations across the country during Black History Month. And she was interviewing me about my life and my career. And she's so great. She's from the South also, and we had a lot in common. And it was just a great night. So that was a fun evening. And I think you showed one quickly that was of me and Stacey Abrams.
Sure, we can put that back up and
okay.
get to that, because I think you know, we're part of our conversation has to take advantage of the opportunity to just look at the voter rights issue as it has come back into the national dialogue in light of the national elections.
Yeah, and this was when Stacey was running for governor of Georgia, and this was at a fundraiser for her in Los Angeles, and she lost that election, as most people know, but she didn't just go into hiding and disappear from the scene. She decided to focus on voter registration and making sure she lost by a small amount, so she wanted to make sure those kind of things didn't happen often. So she began registering voters in Georgia and was very successful. And as you probably know, in the senatorial runoff, a Black senator was elected in Georgia and a Jewish senator, which was pretty groundbreaking. Anyway, to your point, Georgia instituted legislation not too long ago to change the requirements for voting in Georgia. And when you look at it, it's pretty egregious on the face. And I was part of a group of 74 Black executives who sent a letter to the New York Times and Wall Street Journal saying that, you know, everyone should pay attention to this because we're in 2021. And how can you talk about suppressing anyone's vote in 2021? It's not even a partisan issue. Everyone should want more voters. And we just felt that this legislation was wrong and that it had gone through without a really vigorous discussion about it. And then a couple of weeks later, 400 people signed on to another letter. Corporations, not-for-profits, white executives agreeing with us that this was wrong. And so I think it's a sign of you know, corporations being forced or asked to get into more of the political debates. Again, I think it started a lot with George Floyd's murder. Companies really felt like they had to make a statement. Then you go to the voter suppression legislation. There's a LGBTQ legislation in Georgia also that companies took a stand on, and some companies pulled out of Georgia. So it's an interesting place for companies to be. And, you know, eventually the decision is up to the CEO as to what he or she wants to do. But it's gone into the boardroom, and companies are hearing more from their shareholders and customers on ESG issues, environmental, social, governance issues. And some companies are even starting those kind of departments or board committees to oversee this new interest. So here we are.
I mean, and if you would contrast that with when you were first CEO of BET, this feels new. This pressure on on boardrooms and CEOs, and I'm just wondering if that's a perception or if that's actually indicative of something more substantial changing.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's very new. It always was an issue for BET.
Yeah.
And I used to think that was a burden. Our audience always expected us to take a stand and make a statement. And if something happened in the world, to have on programming that addressed that if it affected the Black community. Other networks didn't have that pressure. But overall, I realized that it was a good thing because it showed our audience was passionate about what we were doing. And they wanted us to reflect their positions on things. So I remember the night the verdict came down in the Trayvon Martin case, we were caught off guard, and it was a Saturday night, and we didn't have any programming on, and we had on a comedy, a movie, and we got a lot of criticism for that because they used to expect us to be a 24-hour news network, which we're not, and that takes a lot of money and a lot of resources. But I think it was a call for them to want to hear their own voices and see when an issue came up, to see what this community thought about it. And BET was their way to do that. But for most networks, that wasn't an issue, and definitely not for companies that weren't in the media space. And it is today. People want to know, and I don't know if it's because of millennials that they want to know, what the company stands for, but it's becoming more and more popular.
Well, we've certainly, early in our conversation tonight, talked about the shift around media and cable, sort of from, 4 networks to 30 cable networks to
Right.
a proliferation of cable networks, and now distributing via the internet and across
Right.
all streaming platforms and
Right.
devices. And so what has emerged, I think, is a concept of brand loyalty, particularly among millennials, in terms of, if I'm spending dollars on X, I want to know that it somehow reflects my values. So
Right.
it's quite possible that one side effect of that shift means that everybody is now holding the companies they buy from to account.
Right.
And on topics such as racial justice, we need to get to the place, I think, where this is not seen as a conservative or progressive issue, but simply a human rights issue.
Correct.
And so there ought not be a wrong side.
Right.
It should be something that that we're all engaged in.
Right. No, I thought about that long and hard as I was watching the verdict come in for the police officer in the George Floyd case, because as I heard the verdict being called, I had a sense of relief that it came out the right way.
Right.
But there was also sadness that a man had died in a way that he shouldn't have. And this verdict wasn't going to bring him back. And, I just thought to myself, there's no joy in this. There's relief, but there's no joy. And so much has to be done. And, now we have to get busy and make sure we have that equality we've been talking about for so long.
Yeah, some of the commentators I've been listening to are distinguishing between, their position being that, well, the right verdict occurred,
Right.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that our society is automatically somehow more just than it has been
Right.
before. It might
Yeah.
have provided accountability, but it's not necessarily full justice or full
Right.
progress.
Right. A lot of work needs to be done.
Now, you have chosen to shift your attention to the corporate boardrooms as a place, perhaps that you and your colleagues and can make a difference. Would you please tell us about your new initiative, the Monarchs?
Yeah, the Monarchs Collective. And it's called that because it's called that after the monarch butterfly. And I don't know if you know, but butterflies, when they're being born, they come out of a shell or whatever, not a shell, but a protective covering. And if you open that covering up before they're ready to come out, they won't be able to fly because part of the birthing process is them flapping their wings against the covering so that when they come out, they'll be able to fly. Anyway, that's why we named it the Monarchs Collective, because we want to help board eligible candidates, diverse board eligible candidates, to get on boards and to change the complexion of our corporate boards and leadership, the leadership in C-suites. And, as we talked before, some progress has been made, but not a lot. And I've been very lucky to be on boards for over 20 years. And as you mentioned, I'm on 4 boards right now. And it was a very important part of my career. And the first thing I do is try to get more people who look like me on boards. And when I stepped down from BET, I realized most of the calls I was getting were either from companies who wanted me on their boards or candidates who wanted to know how to get on boards. So again, after the George Floyd murder, I wanted to figure out a way to give back. And so my partner and I, Rabia Deland Long, decided to start this company and do some training of candidates if they need it, what a boardroom is like, what is involved, and help companies with training so they're more welcoming to diverse board members. And also help the companies and candidates find each other, because the excuse that we can't find qualified people of color or women to be on boards is just not true. And you've seen the California legislation where it's saying that certain companies California companies need to have a certain number of women or people of color on their boards. Then we had NASDAQ saying they wouldn't take a company public if it didn't have diversity on the board, and same with Goldman and BlackRock. So this is becoming a big issue, and it should be, because so much of the power of corporate America resides with the boards, and we need to change that.
How ready are you finding boardrooms to have this conversation? To what extent is this, lip service and checking the box versus being ready to be very serious about bringing this level of change about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I hope it's not a moment, that it's a movement, that companies are feeling the pressure and can't let another 5 years go by without doing anything. So you saw a lot of movement this summer, of putting butts in seats, as I call it, and that's a starting point. But they have to be committed to more than that. They have to be committed to changing their culture, changing their environment, so that diverse board candidates feel secure in having their voice heard. Because if you're in the boardroom and your voice isn't heard or not encouraged, then nothing has changed. So I'm hoping that it continues to be an issue that consumers and shareholders push, and shareholder organizations, as they review companies' performance every year. They look at the boards and rank them.
Just for our viewing and listening audience, if you have a question for Ms. Debra Lee, please drop it in the Q&A as we move into this next part of our conversation together. You also mentioned, Debra, a few minutes ago, the movement to accept more environmental and social either policies or investments. Could you characterize that in a little bit more detail for us?
Well, I should say today's Earth Day. I think it's still Earth Day, unless I got my days mixed up. So I should recognize that. But it's part of the ESG movement that I talked about, where shareholders and consumers are looking to companies and saying, what are you doing to help the environmental crisis? Are you changing the way you produce products? Are you donating to, the green projects? And so several of the boards I'm on have spent a lot of time explaining what they're doing, how they're changing things. I know we had a presentation at Burberry where they showed us how they were changing how cashmere was produced so they wouldn't use as much water. So this is a concern for for people going forward. And we all know that, we're the ones who are going to leave the earth to our children. And, we don't want it to continue to get worse. So as I said, some companies are starting committees or having a professional come in to oversee this work. But it is a question that's being asked more.
And do you think this is more because people or leaders or companies are recognizing it's the right thing to do, or is it because of pressure from consumers and stakeholders?
I think that people are beginning to realize that the government can't do it all, and that there needs to be another voice in these debates, and that's corporate America. And I think because government has stayed out of these debates recently, that companies have had to take a stand. So I think it's a combination of pressure and realizing it's the right thing to do, especially if these issues affect your company's performance or your employees. If you have a lot of lower skilled workers and the immigration laws are being changed, as a company, you should take a stand on it and let the government know what your position is. So, our world has been turned upside down by COVID and going through this. And I think coming out of it, we're going to have different priorities, and we're going to have to work together, more as a country and to make it a better place. We're just going to have to.
And indeed, I think some companies are realizing that it's also good for their business. The bottom
Right.
line, in addition to being good, in addition to being responsive,
Right.
it's also can also be good for the bottom line.
Right. And I didn't mention this before, but data has shown that companies with more diverse boards have higher profitability. So it really does work. It really does work.
Good. Let me take a first question that we have lined up from, I think, Asja is how you pronounce this person's name. And the question is, what are some lessons that you can share that you learned by being a pioneer?
That's interesting. Like I said, when I was going through this, I'd never thought of myself as a pioneer. I had my head down working, trying to build this network. But I guess in retrospect, I would say that it's important to find your voice. It's important to find your values if you're going to be a corporate leader or if you're going to lead a company, because you want what you're doing at work to have the same values that you have personally. It sometimes takes us a while, especially as women, to find our voices. So I would encourage young people to do that early. Find out what's important to you, what's important to your family, and take those values to work with you. I would also say that you can do well and do good at the same time. And by that, I mean, you can have a company that has excellent financial performance, but you can also give back in however you want to, whether it's through monetary contributions or through community service. I think I mentioned this before. I think I was lucky being at BET for people to expect me to be outspoken and to take a stand. And because it made me think through larger issues when things happen. How did 9/11 affect the people in Harlem? No one was talking about that. What is the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina? We put a telethon together really quickly and raised $14 million for victims of Katrina. So I like having that. I was brought up that you gave back. And I tell a story often. My mother would write a check for $5 to the American Cancer Society. And that's all she had, but she wanted to contribute. And that was what she did. And I always remember that. And I just think it's so important to our world that as corporate leaders or whatever you do in life, that you find a way to give back.
Thank you. This next question is from Wilhelmina. And the question is, do boards reach out to you directly and ask you for candidates from the Monarch Collective? And really, I guess, looking for more detail on how this connection and
Right.
the service that the group provides. How does that actually
Yeah.
work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're building a database of board eligible candidates. So if you want to submit your name, go to www.monarchscollective.com. And then we're talking to a lot of companies, and we're hoping some of them hire us to fulfill their needs. But one thing I've been impressed with is the quality of people who have contacted us to say they want to serve on boards. And they don't always have the typical profile, but they're clearly competent, and they're clearly would bring a lot to add to any company. And I think companies are broadening their filter of what they're looking for. You know, it used to be a time when you had to be a CEO to be on a board. That's not true anymore. You know, boards could be looking for cybersecurity experts, or someone who understands international global markets, or someone in marketing. So you know, it's a matter of I think, one, letting people know that you're interested in serving on a board. That's the first step. Either your boss or other people you know that are on boards. And two, making sure that you have the experience, and that could be on a not-for-profit board. You know, I recommend if people on a not-for-profit board get on the audit committee and learn about the financial situation of the organization, because that's a skill that's easily transferable. So companies are reaching out to us, and individuals are reaching out to us. I had a situation, a board placement assignment a couple of weeks ago, and I talked to the CEO. He told me what he was looking for. I gave him 3 names, and he interviewed all 3 of them. And I was like, this is the way it's supposed to work. And it felt so good to have made that connection. I don't know if any one of the 3 are going to actually be placed on the board, but it looks like it. So I was excited.
Yeah, it almost feels like it's a form of matchmaking.
You're
Or,
right. I was going to say the same thing. Mhm.
it's no different than recruiting a high-level executive, but you're
Exactly.
also looking for people at the board level in a similar way to the skills and profile that you want for individual leadership
Right.
positions at the employee stage.
Yeah. And you know, the common thought is that the first board is the hardest, you know, and once you're on your first for-profit board, it's easier to get others. But it shouldn't be that way, because you can be board ready without having served on another for-profit board. You know, I know a lot of individuals that see their own board operate, either because they're presenting or working with board activities. So there are a lot of ways to get the experience, and you know, you learn a lot after your first board, but it shouldn't be a detriment if you
Yeah,
haven't
I
been
think
on one.
individuals certainly can, if you would agree, you know, look on this as learning experience as much
Right.
as a contributing experience.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've gotten so much out of my board service, learning about different industries, meeting amazing people that I serve on the boards with, watching other CEOs handle issues and how they handle the board. I mean, for me, it was almost like going to business school, because I went to Kennedy School instead of business school. But you know, you learn so much. And a secret that's often kept is that you can create wealth by serving on boards. You know, you get board fees, plus you get stock in the company. And, you know, if the company does well and you contribute to that, you know, you can create a path to wealth. And so much of this is just not known. And I think the more we talk about it, the more people will look for these opportunities.
Is there additional ways that we can all cultivate, you know, more the next generation of leaders, whether it be from communities of color, to add more gender diversity?
Mhm.
You know, beyond the board, what advice do you have for for leaders of organizations
Right.
in doing that?
Well, yeah, I think first of all, if you're a leader of an organization, you should encourage your executives to look for board opportunities. Some companies actually prohibit it, which is too bad. I think it's really short-sighted. Um, but you can develop your own executives by having them have board experience. I think the other thing, if you serve on a board and you get a call or know people who are looking for board candidates, be sure to recommend someone. Don't just say I'm not interested. Be sure to recommend someone, and I think that's very important. And there's so many courses now that are popping up in the board area. I know Harvard has one, and I've heard of several others. People should look for the opportunity to take those courses and learn what's involved. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there, and it's about networking and connecting to people different from yourself.
Right, right. Which we all, I think, can benefit from if
Right.
we're open to the experience.
Exactly. Exactly.
The third question I see lined up here is from Danita and asks, oh, this is a big one. None of the others weren't too, but coming out of COVID, how has the pandemic affected your vision for your future plans?
Oh, that's a hard one. This has been a hard year, personally and professionally. I think it's made me put things in priority. I think we were all on a kind of a fast track before this happened, and there were probably a lot of things we were doing that we didn't really need to do. I know I was doing a lot of traveling. I was just used to it, and between boards and speaking engagements, when we get back to traveling again, I don't plan to do that much of it. I just, have found that it's not all that necessary, and we've all learned that Zoom works, and you can do interviews this way. You can do help applicants this way. So I think we're gonna have a new normal. We're not gonna go back to the way we were. It's pushed people into the digital age, maybe kicking and screaming. More people are shopping online now than probably would have if we hadn't had this pandemic and quarantine. So I think a lot of things are going to be different, but I hope that what comes out of it is that there's more humanity, that we realize that everything is not in our control. And as government leaders and corporate leaders and head of households, you never know what's going to happen. And I think this is something that really shook us to our core in terms of being something that we couldn't control. And now we're getting it under control, but I think it'll leave a mark on us for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, my own thought on this topic is really that the pandemic accelerated some trends that were
Right.
already underway, particularly as you
Yes.
mentioned, the technological ones and the ones where technology is becoming more of an enabling factor in many aspects of our life. But equally, I think we miss some of the in-person
Oh yeah.
activities that we were
No.
able to do.
Yeah. No question.
And I know for ourselves, it's once we are able to return to more in-person service, how do we keep the things that we learn to do differently and well, such as
Right.
this conversation tonight, but yet blend that with what we crave as human beings, which
Right.
is the ability to go to places and
And
the
see
ability
people.
to some extent to be physically in places with other human beings.
Right. No, I think that's very important, and this quarantine has shown us how important that is. I mean, I've just beginning at being over 65 and getting my vaccine fairly early, beginning to see friends that I haven't seen for over a year. And we're getting together now in small groups, but you do miss that human interaction. And on the other hand, if you're a company, do you need the board to come 10 times a year? Maybe they can come 5 times a year. and you know that Zoom works for the other 5. So I think it's going to be a mix of things, and some things we're going to learn from this that we continue to do moving forward. But you're right. I mean, there's so many people that can't wait to get back to work, to get back to, you know, conferences and or galas or all the other ways we interact socially. You know, being stranded in your house for over a year is more than a notion. And I think the part that we have to pay close attention to is there going to be some mental health issues that come out of this.
No,
And
I agree.
yeah, and I
It's almost like we've deferred a lot of the trauma from the last year that we will have
right,
to deal with.
yeah,
I'm staying on the topic of COVID for a moment and just connecting this to the BET. So BET, I learned in preparing and chatting with you tonight that it was as much, an information and news and commentator channel
right,
as an entertainment channel.
right,
And, one of the problems that the pandemic has illustrated is many of us don't know who to trust in media
right,
and what information is actually, well, even in some cases true, and what is not
hmm,
true.
right.
And so I wonder if you would go with me on this question and talk about the responsibility of the media for helping people get to truth and calling out falsities where they exist.
Right. Well, things have changed so much uh, in media and in news and information, um, to the point where we have particular news channels that are, have a point of view. I mean, I was raised that media should be objective.
Right.
And that you should try to give both sides of it, and that it should not be, too far left or too far right. I think as a world, we've gotten used to news channels having a point of view and knowing the ones we like to watch because we agree with it, which I think is too bad because you don't hear the other side of the argument. And I think it makes us more divisive. Even though BET had a predominantly Black audience, when I was running it, I always tried to have the news be objective. Well, first of all, not all Black people think the same thing. And so I never wanted that to, it looked like we were trying to say that. And second of all, I felt it was our obligation to reflect the point of view, but also to give the competing viewpoint. So I hate to see that we've gone as a country and a world so far away from that. And I hope that one of the things that happens in the future is that news networks will be less political and less, only one point of view. Because I don't think that's helpful to us or to our children growing up.
Or could they at least admit when they're doing opinion news
Right.
versus journalistic reporting?
Exactly.
That would be even a modest step forward
Step in the right. Yeah.
for experience.
I agree. I agree.
Let alone being able to talk about trust in science or medicine,
Hmm.
even if you can't be 100% sure of some things, as we've seen during COVID.
Right.
If there are other questions for Ms. Lee, please put them in. I want to ask our producers to bring up this wonderful picture of you and our former president, Barack Obama, because I think it just captures a beautiful moment. What's he like in person?
Oh, he's a great guy. And okay, I'm going to be a little partisan here. I've known Barack since he ran for senator. In fact, we were on a panel together before he ran for senator at Harvard Law School one year. And it was about alums of Harvard that had gone to do different things. And so most of the people on the panel were business people. And here is this guy with the big ears from Chicago. We're all like, why is he on this panel? I think he was a state senator at the time. But obviously the moderator of the panel knew that he was going to be much bigger than that. But anyway, I got to know him when he was running for senator. And we kept in touch. When he came to DC and lived there part-time when he was a senator. And then when he was getting ready to run for president, he called me and said, I'm reaching out to all my big supporters and I just want to know what you think. And I was so honored. And I said, well, it's really an issue that you and Michelle need to decide. And I said, but if you run, I'll support you. We've been close ever since then. So I had the honor of being in Washington, living in Washington the 8 years that he was in office, and just hanging out at the White House. I mean, it was a magical 8 years. But he's a great person, just so super smart, as is Michelle. And they care so much about people and our country and our world. And it was really my honor to get to know him as a person and consider him a friend.
What a important moment of progress for our country to have the first the first African American president.
Right.
Of course, we now have the first woman,
right.
Also person of color, vice president.
Yeah. Right.
But we also have this intervening period where so much tension between different parts of our nation came more back into the spotlight as
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts on how do we go forward from here? We had these 8 years under President Obama. We had the 4 years under Donald Trump, which clearly we saw even up until January 5th, January 6th events.
Right.
As a reaction. And yet, what do we do now as a nation to bring together what appear to be very divided elements?
Right. Well, I hope the Biden-Harris administration can bring people together more in a cooperative way. I think what President Biden has done with the vaccines is really incredible. That he's delivered on getting millions of people vaccinated. I just have to hope that the divisiveness has gone away. But I know it hasn't. I mean, there's still very differing views. But I hope if we can have an administration that's not so divisive, where President Biden, who's worked in the Senate and was a vice president, can get people to work together, we'll be in a much better position going forward. I heard John Boehner talk on one of the news shows the other day, and I thought his comments were enlightening, that he was saying he thought the divisiveness had gone too far. So I hope there's leaderships on both sides of the fence that really sees it's critical to bring our country together.
Do you think more discourse, more dialogue, more conversation between people of differing viewpoints, is that one way forward, or is that a lost cause?
No, I think that's one way forward, but I think we have to deal with these major issues that are preventing that, like police brutality and financial inequality, healthcare inequalities. I mean, we have to solve some of these problems first. I mean, we should be talking all along, but I think part of that discussion should be, how do we solve these issues? Because if we keep having people killed in the streets by police, we're never going to get over this divisiveness, and you're going to have one part of the country that thinks one way and another part that sees it differently. So we have to find some common ground. You may know that the Business Roundtable that represents companies in this country are looking at issues like police brutality and inequalities and how they can help. So again, I'm glad to see companies stepping up and taking a stand, because I keep saying this is 2021 and things should have improved by now. I'm a child of the 50s and the 60s and remember the marches and the riots. And, it just feels like, we haven't made as much progress as we can.
Well, we talked about Boston at the top of the conversation and what that was like back in the 70s. And, that not a great time for this city that, as you noted,
Right.
had one reputation as being progressive and about a more inclusive agenda, yet on the ground, there were clearly real challenges and
Right.
real differences. We also talked a little bit earlier that, in light of the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the verdict that came out this week, that if I can put these words on our conversation, there appears to be a new appetite for real change that maybe is more of a movement than a moment. And I don't know if that's because people like me are just waking up to the challenge in a new way, or if there's a real sense of more progress on our horizon than has been possible before, perhaps not even since the Voting Rights Act originally.
Right. Well, I hope your optimism is true, and I think one thing that has come out of this, the George Floyd murder, is people talking about race more and systemic racism and what it's caused, and how we combat that, and how we move forward. And we have to talk to each other and hear each other out. And I look at the young people who have lived through this for the first time, and they grew up in a different environment, where they went to school with people that didn't look like them, and they have friends with people who didn't look like them, and all of a sudden, they're seeing the country dissolve into this bitterness. And police, especially police, they're there to protect us. And if you have to raise your kids to be afraid of police and not know what's going to happen when you got stopped by a policeman, that's just unacceptable. So I think a lot of people found solace in the fact that the police officer was convicted, because that so rarely happens. So hopefully that's a sign. But of course, then that same night, we had a 16-year-old girl shot. And people are, asking, why is the force, why is so much excessive force used? When you could shoot someone in the leg, or you don't even have to shoot, there's so many things to talk about. And I hope us talking to each other will solve some of these problems.
Great. Well, I'm going to end with one more question.
Okay.
This is from Irma Lande, who is wondering, on the mentorship front, what advice to women of color looking to break into media and communications would you give today?
Oh, that's a hard one. I would say, if you want to get into media, to start early with internships and any positions that you can take on. It's a very competitive area. For some reason, students especially, and professionals are always attracted to it. But I would say, make your interests known early, and start doing things in the field, even if they're not at the level that you want to get to eventually. Sometimes when I look at the path I took, I wish I had known of my interest in media earlier. I would have taken all different courses in law school. I wouldn't have majored in Chinese communist ideology when I was in college. You want to be expansive and learn things, but you also want to build a resume and a career that gets you where you want to go. So I would say, you know, take opportunities wherever you can to get your foot in the door, and be persistent.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for the conversation tonight.
Oh, thank you.
It's great to help you celebrate your career so far and also to learn about your new and current interests. And we wish you all the best of that. And maybe we'll get to see you here in Boston in person at some time in the future.
I would love
So
that.
thank you again.
Thank
And
you for having me.
thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you on a future occasion. And please be safe, be well. We'll see you next time. Thank you.